Big update from God. We got to read the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Sorry, U.S. Customs. I just had to have approximately 450 cuneiform tablets.
Sorry, TSA. I've had a vision. I've had an update from God after lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Unbelievable, the podcast where we have unfortunately made a little oopsie. Well, I guess maybe it's more proper to say I made an oopsie. So Luis and I recorded our last episode where I told him 2 unbelievable stories from history, and then I managed to delete my audio, and unfortunately that was a permanent mistake, so that episode is gone. And just for an extra kick in the teeth, Luis has fallen deathly ill. We don't know if he'll pull through or not.
That's true.
He could give in at any moment during this recording, so be ready for his death cough.
That's right. Here I am at death's door, and what's the final thing that you'll catch me doing? Of course, recording this podcast.
Creating some content.
Exactly. At the end of the day, I am Gen Z. I live for that content. And apparently, I live and die for that content. Hooray.
Exactly. If Luis will have one last thing, it's approval from the masses.
Yeah.
Hopefully. So, obviously, I cannot retell Luis these stories because he now knows which one is true. But the true story was a very fun one, so we don't want to pass it. So instead, what we're going to do is a little True Tales episode where I will tell the true story from our past episode that was lost, and Luis also has a little true story from me, just so we get to do a little learning. Or I guess I do. Luis doesn't get to hear anything new. And also, he's deathly ill. Did we mention that? Anyway.
It's all right. You know, I think my ailment, my illness, still allows me to have some fun and enjoy some of my time here with you. Guess we'll see, Kurt. I mean, I heard the way you explained it to me last time. So, if anything, I'll be the judge of whether or not you did a good enough job this time. Second time around, when you had more practice, you know?
Yeah, I've been thinking about the fact, because in real time, it is like only 4 days since we recorded the last episode. So I've been thinking, on one hand, maybe you'll get to appreciate the story in a different way because you've had time to think about it. But then I'm also like, maybe Luis's goldfish brain already reset. Maybe this will be all new info to him. So either way, I'm excited to see what you bring.
Great.
But before we get to all that, one other thing that was lost in our deleted recording was a very interesting fast fact that you told. Could you please give us the information of that fast fact again?
Yes, of course, Kurt. That's something I'll be glad to say. So last time I framed this as a true or false question, but I'm just gonna state out this is something that happened and something that frankly is very funny to me.
And that everyone needs to know about.
And that everyone needs to know about this is that Hobby Lobby, the famous American hobby shop, I guess you could call it.
Retail store.
The retail, yeah, I guess. Hobby Lobby in around early 2000s, as a result of the U.S.'s invasion in Iraq, was caught smuggling items from Iraq into the hands of the Green family, which is the family that owns all of the Hobby Lobby family. Now, when I say some ancient artifacts, some items of antiquity, I don't mean like a clay tablet. I don't mean like 3 stones. I actually mean around 11,000 pieces of ancient artifacts were taken in by Hobby Lobby, which unreal, honestly.
Unreal.
Yeah. The best part of this is that what reason did the Green family give for needing these artifacts, which, mind you, Kurt, the Green family is an evangelical Christian family, really Bible-thumping type of family. I think Hobby Lobby even had a scandal not too long ago regarding them, as well as LGBTQ rights and them being homophobic, etc.
Hobby Lobby's got his hands full with scandals.
They do. Really, Hobby Lobby is nothing but crafty. And by that, I mean crafty at getting into scandals and getting canceled. Now, these artifacts were, funny enough, intended for the Green family's Museum of the Bible, which, if you think about it and if we phrase it in a certain way, they were answering to the will of God to take these ancient artifacts into their possession. And one of the big items that they took was actually a fragment of the Epic of Gilgamesh, believe it or not.
The Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah, one of
How
the
does that even
oldest
happen?
Stories. This is probably thought that during the time of the Iraq invasion, or the U.S.'s invasion of Iraq, they stole a lot of things from Iraq's National Museum. I mean, and by they, I mean the U.S. right? And part of the things that were smuggled out was a piece of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and somehow it ended up in the hands of the Green family and therefore Hobby Lobby, which very funny to me.
Right.
And all of this came to light in around 2009, Kurt, right? So this is very recent. And last but not least, it did give us, or at least this whole court scandal, right? Because U.S. Customs found this, then the U.S. government found this, and in one of the first times of rich people getting their come up, the Green family and Hobby Lobby were actually sanctioned. And the best part of all of this is that in 2011, a struggle between Hobby Lobby and the federal government culminated in a civil case, which has probably my favorite case name ever. Are you ready, Kurt?
Oh, please.
It's United States of America v. approximately 450 ancient cuneiform tablets and approximately 3,000 ancient clay boule. That's the full name of it, which is incredible. I think just the use of approximately within any official case is hilarious to me. And luckily, this was settled by Hobby Lobby agreeing to return these artifacts, and they paid a fine of around $3 million. They've since returned over 11,000 items of antiquity back to Iraq, including, Kurt, the Epic of Gilgamesh fragment. And this is actually from an article in September 23rd, 2021 of Smithsonian Magazine. And in the editor's note, it says, quote, 2 months after Hobby Lobby forfeited the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet to the United States government, the 3,500-year-old artifact is officially headed home to Iraq. As Colleen Long reports for the Associated Press, the cuneiform tablet will be repatriated this afternoon in a ceremony held at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, unquote. So this was September 23rd, 2021. So we can assume that we've made it. We did it, folks.
Hobby Lobby is no longer in possession of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
That's right. That's right. So good work on their team, and good work, the U.S. judicial system. You did something right for once. You got the Epic of Gilgamesh back to Iraq.
That's just insane. Because if for anyone who's not familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's considered like the oldest fiction story or just the oldest story in general.
Yeah.
Hobby Lobby is just up to something. I don't know what they got going on. It's one of these schemes that's so good that it's like, as much as, we hate to see a little pillaging going on, you don't have to hand it to Hobby Lobby, but you almost have to hand it to Hobby Lobby for just such a brazen act of saying, oh, there's a vacuum of chaos created by a war. Let's just get in here and steal some ancient artifacts. No worries.
And I think my favorite part of all this is that, this was all meant to go to the Museum of the Bible that the Green family has.
Right.
However, the Epic of Gilgamesh does include a passage where a great flood totally covered the world. And historians and archaeologists believe that this is a story that inspired the stories in the Bible. So awesome, honestly. I think if they're adding this to the Museum of the Bible, they're counting this as like a source, like a citation that the Bible used. That's really funny.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe the Green family is just with this really hot take here. They're like, this is a museum of all the texts that the Bible was based on. This is not at all about the validity of the Bible.
That's right.
We need a reason to get the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, what are you gonna do?
That's right. Yeah, but hey, congratulations, Iraq. You've got your thing back from Hobby Lobby and about 10,000 more.
Approximately 10,000 more cuneiform tablets.
Yeah.
Well, yes, that's good fun. We always love to hear about a little Hobby Lobby scandal. But that being said, let's move on to our story that, again, Luis, you have heard this recently, but I know you're a good sport, so you'll play along as if you're reacting to it for the first time, of course.
Wow. Can you believe that? Oh, that's incredible. Those are just some examples that you can use to edit in, Kurt, in case I don't react accordingly.
Yeah, I'll just apply them as needed.
Yeah.
So, Luis, as you probably remember from our previous recording, this is a story of the formation of a cult. And interestingly, this was a story of a cult that neither you nor I had heard of before I brought it to the podcast. So any cult lovers out there, this is probably going to be a fresh one to you. For some reason, as wild as this is a very unknown story. So before we get all into it, let me give you a little context of the events that happened predating this. this. So the Protestant Reformation in Switzerland started about 200 years before the main character of our story was born. There were different Protestant Reformations that happened all over Europe during the 16th century, and basically each time this was people thinking that the Catholic Church wasn't following the Bible strictly enough, or they weren't following it in the proper way, and so they would break off and form their own church. And of course, Luis, as you can imagine, this led to lots of fighting. In Switzerland, the Reformation movement was started by a pastor named Huldrych Zwingli, and the movement led to actual physical fighting between the Catholic Church and Protestant movements, including literally multiple wars. Now, it wouldn't be till several years later that the main character of our story, Margaretta Peter, was born in 1794, but at the time she was born, Switzerland was still very divided between Catholicism and Protestantism. The majority of the country was some type of Protestant, but all in all, this was still very much a hotbed of new Christian religious ideas. So here goes the birth of our protagonist, future cult leader, a girl named Margaretta Peter, and she was born on Christmas Day in 1794 in the Swiss village of Wildesbuch in the southeast of Switzerland.
Wildesbuch.
Margaretta was the youngest of 6 children. She had 4 older sisters and 1 older brother. Margaretta's mother passed away at some point when Margaretta was a baby, so she was primarily raised by her father, who was a man named John Peter. And Margaretta was raised under the Protestant ideology of Zwinglianism. Shout out to our former boy, Huldrych Zwingli. This is his thing that he started.
Yeah.
From a very young age, Margaretta was said to be both remarkably smart and dedicated to studying religion. Starting at age 6, she would get her family together to make them listen to her read from the Bible and lecture them, and sometimes the neighbors would even join in too. And you know, Luis, since you know where this story is going, this is interesting that I guess we all know we're headed for cult territory, but starting at age 6, founding your cult, that's pretty young. I mean, at this point, I wouldn't say that she's in cult founding territory, but she's, you know, getting people together to do some Bible study when she's only 6 years old. So, you know, really very prolific future cult leader Margaretta is.
What were you doing at 6 years old, Kurt? I don't know. I don't think anything of substance.
I know. I really feel like a failure now, not starting a cult, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. I mean, you know what people tell you, if you ever feel like a failure, just remember that X person didn't start their acting career until they were 30, or this other person didn't become famous until they were 40. Yeah, Margaretta was already starting a cult at 6, okay? So don't get too in your head, all right?
No matter what, we've all failed. We're all older than 6 years old.
Yeah.
Nobody here listening to this is younger than 6.
No.
We've all missed the
No.
boat to start a cult, frankly. Now, Margaretta was said to have a personality that was equal parts forceful and persuasive, and this probably contributed a lot to her ability to get people together. One thing that illustrates this was a quote from the pastor of Margaretta's church. He said, quote, "Unquestionably, Margaretta was the cleverest of the family. Her promises to observe all I taught were most fervent. I had the best hopes for her, although I observed somewhat of extravagance in her. Margaretta speedily obtained an absolute supremacy in her father's house. All must do what she ordered. Her will expressed by word of mouth or by letter when absent was obeyed as the will of God." So, Margaretta is here laying down the law.
Girl boss.
Girl boss, absolutely, dude. Come on. In 1816, when Margaretta was 20, her uncle invited her to come oversee his household while he did some work on the farm in a village called Rudolfingen. And it turns out, apparently, Margaretta was very good at being in charge of a farm. Margaretta's uncle said she had brought God's blessings to the house and the farm. But more importantly than this, while in Rudolfingen, Margaretta began studying with a Protestant group known as the Pietists. Now, the Pietists believed in meeting in small private groups to study the Bible together and pray. They also believed in strict adherence to the scripture and kind of had this idea that no matter what, you're doing a lot of sinning, so the best thing you can do is be as pious as possible and pray for God's mercy. Now, in addition to these beliefs, this specific group of Pietists also believed in speaking in tongues and receiving visions and prophecies from God. So we're getting a little bit more out there on the Protestant religious front.
Oh, the normal things.
We talked a little bit in our lost recording about the decorum of Catholicism, and that you have the skull of this person or the chalice of this or whatever. I wasn't raised Catholic, so I don't know what the things are, but I know there's a lot of very important items in the mix.
Yeah.
And Protestants getting their start a little bit later in history, not so many skulls to be parading around.
That's
so
right.
you got to do something to get people excited. Speaking in tongues and receiving some visions and prophecies always does the trick, frankly.
That's so true, Kurt. I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned this because you're right. Whenever we hear speaking in tongues and doing these other rites, or I don't know, in other cases like the Shakers and Quakers that shook and quook, quaked, I guess.
No, it's quook.
Quook, yeah, quoke. Whenever we hear of these things, we tend to think of them as kind of strange, kind of wild, especially if you're raised in a Catholic environment. And let's be honest, Kurt. Catholics are not doing anything less weird, okay? You briefly touched on it, and look, I wasn't raised Catholic, but I was under the cruel hands of the Jesuits in 8 years of my life. And
Oh, come on.
okay, they were not cruel, but
The iron fist of the Jesuits.
yeah, the Jesuits had me under their yoke for about 8 years of my life. And okay, like, you parade around a skull and call it the skull of Mary Magdalene, and it's a skull like decorated in gold. Or I don't know, the other day I was reading about incorrupt bodies, aka those bodies of saints that died and somehow they were mummified, so that's how they still keep them to this day. And so you have some churches where you just literally have a mummy.
Oh?
Yeah, like of these bodies of people that are like, ooh, their body never rotted when they died, so here it is, and we keep them here in this box. And when you take a moment to step away and think about all these different rites, you get to realize these are weird things. So, looking forward at this religious conversion of Switzerland at this time, listen with an open mind. Mm-hmm. If you're listening to convulsions, if you're listening to speaking in tongues, take it with an open mind and an open heart. It will be better for all of us.
Seriously, I think there is something about, like, the combination of the things the pietists believe, because I really want to stress that, like, one of their core beliefs was this idea that no matter what, you're making mistakes, so you should just pray for mercy. So there was a lot of, like, you should feel very guilty about the way you are in life, because as a human, you're messing up no matter what.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of half of it. You get very brought down by that, but then believing that you could be the conduit for visions and prophecies, it's very easy to buy into. So I think it really is kind of a package deal. Everybody's got to have their own hustle at this time, because Switzerland, it's a dogfight to get the Protestants or the Catholics in there. You got to be converting people as fast as possible.
You're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting a little bit of the Catholic guilt built in already, but then you also had this other really fun, progressive thing of, but maybe I'm the voice of God. Ever thought about that? I don't know. I'm into it.
We're all into it, Margaretta included. And this seems like this was kind of the effect it had on Margaretta, because when she went home to visit her family, her sisters found her to be uncharacteristically quiet, even seeming like she was depressed. She told them that God was revealing himself to her more and more every day, so that she became aware of her own sinfulness. So she's big buying into the pietist deal, it seems. Now, after a year of running her uncle's farm, Margaretta returned to her home in Wildesbuch in March 1817.
Wildesbuch.
And after returning, Margaretta went all in on her religious teaching. And this is kind of the point in time where people are not just, coming over to listen to her do some 6-year-old preaching. They're like really, really believing in Margaretta to the point where they're becoming her followers. So this is a list of kind of the people who were her more significant followers, because over the next few years in this story, she gained tons and tons of followers. These are the more important ones. Primarily, of course, Margaretta's family. They've been here since the 6-year-old days. Margaretta's father, brother, and sisters followed her teachings completely without question, and in some cases this would even extend to her sisters' husbands. For example, Margaretta's sister Magdalena and her husband John kicked John's elderly mother out of the house on Margaretta's instructions because the old woman was too worldly and void of, quote, saving grace.
Bye, Mom. See ya.
Bye, Mom. Margaretta said it's bad. Sorry. Now, in addition to the family, Margaretta's father had hired some servants to help take care of the house while Margaretta was gone, and when Margaretta returned, all the servants soon became devoted followers of her. The 3 servants' names were Heinrich, Margaret, and Ursula, and I know this can be a little bit confusing because we've got Margaretta, the, preaching prophet here, but also Margaret the servant. So luckily, there's a specific detail about Margaret to identify her. Margaret suffered from epileptic seizures. Now, for some reason, Margaretta interpreted her seizures as demonic possession, which allegedly only Margaretta was able to cure. But as you may remember from me telling you before, Luis, a lot of the stories that come after this involve Margaret having a seizure at some point. So it's not really clear to me how much, if any, Margaretta was helping with this or what she was exactly supposed to be doing. But either way, she's in the mix, okay?
How good were your powers, ma'am? Not too strong, I guess.
Now, Margaretta also traveled around Switzerland, sometimes with one or more of her sisters preaching the gospel. This this would, of course, gain a lot of followers. On one of these trips, she met a baroness named Juliane von Krudner, who had basically been doing the same thing as Margaretta, where she was traveling around preaching her own version of Protestantism, except Juliane had several years already doing this, so she had amassed several followers traveling around Europe. Juliane actually ended up getting kicked out of Switzerland for preaching whatever her message was. You know, this is, again, in the time where we're getting into actual physical conflict over the question of Catholicism versus Protestantism, so getting kicked out of the country is probably just like a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
But anyway, when Juliane left, she basically gave Margaretta her religious endorsements. So all of Juliane's followers in the area became Margaretta's followers, and Margaretta's house in Wildesbuch became sort of a pseudo-pilgrimage site for people to travel to see Margaretta, who, by the way, they start calling intermittently Saint Margaret at this point.
Nice.
Now, finally, perhaps one of the most important people in this cast of followers was a shoemaker named Jacob Morph. And Luis, here is a little short and sweet description that I have of Jacob Morph. Jacob Morph was, quote, a married man, age 30, small, with a head like a pumpkin. And, you know, that tells us everything we need to know right there. We got the man dead to rights. Now, Jacob heard about Margaretta through a traveling preacher who had met her, and he was so interested in Margaretta that he made sure to introduce himself personally when she traveled to his village. Then, after this, he would frequently travel to Wildesbuch to see her. And then, in 1820, Margaretta moved into the house of one of her followers who lived in Zurich to do some missionary work in the area for a few months. And during this time, Jacob Morph would visit the house in Zurich for several weeks at a time, off and on, until finally Jacob Morph's wife traveled to Zurich to convince him to come home and actually do some shoemaking so they can, you know, put food on the table and whatnot. He actually has to, like, get back to his life.
Yeah.
So Jacob Morph went home, but this did not last long because in January 1821, Margaretta traveled to Jacob's village, then the two of them returned to Wildesbuch, and for most of that year, either Jacob was visiting Wildesbuch or Margaretta was visiting his village, or the two of them happened to be traveling together somewhere else. Now, in addition to spending all this time together, Margaretta and Jacob sent each other letters, and some of these contain stuff like Margaretta telling Jacob that they'll ascend to heaven together and sit side by side on thrones for eternity, but a lot of parts sound more like this. Now, this is a quote from a letter from Margaretta to Jacob. Quote, oh, how great is my love. It is stronger than death. Oh, how dear you are to me. I could hug you to my heart 1,000 times. And then written very small below that in the margins of the paper, it said, quote, these words are for your eye alone.
Aww.
But it seems these words would not be for Jacob's eye alone because Jacob's wife read all of this and was understandably not very happy about it.
Don't you just hate it when a marriage gets in the way of your love story?
When a marriage gets in the way of your rapture, that's terrible, dude.
Come on. I was going to live in heaven side by side to you forever.
Well, luckily, Jacob is able to, soothe the waters here because he tells his wife that these are only spiritual affections. This is purely just a little bit of intense Bible study we're doing with Margaretta.
Yeah, right.
All in all, it's unclear what the extent of Jacob and Margaretta's relationship was, but I think this next story kind of reveals what the situation was. In 1822, Margaretta and her sister Elizabeth disappeared for several months. Now, eventually the police came to their house in Wildesbuch to question their father. He told the police he didn't know where they were, and police told him if he didn't produce the girls by a certain date, he would have to pay a fine. And Luis, I know I made a lot of this the first time I told you the story, but it still gets me. What, a fine?
Yeah, man.
He's gonna have to pay a fine if he doesn't produce his missing daughters? What are we doing?
Yeah,
what are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that we are not getting to hear the other story here, but I think what really was a through line last time you told this story was just the incompetency of police. And it's frankly quite comforting that it's been the same for over 200 years. You know, nothing has changed.
That's true. The Swiss police are like, you may have done something with your daughters. We'll have to threaten you with a fine. And meanwhile, the Bolivian police are like, look, they're not here. Neither is the Garden of Eden. Let's pack it in, folks.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, none of you will know what that means because we've lost the episode.
Correct.
But there it is anyway. Now, luckily, it would not come to the point of Margaretta's father having to pay a fine because on January 11th, 1823, Margaretta and Elizabeth mysteriously reappeared. When they showed back up, Margaretta looked pale and sickly, and we never find out what happened in this time you were missing, but it seems like there's some pretty easy conclusions you can draw from this, especially given her odd relationship with Jacob Morph. But either way, this led to an extreme change in Margaretta's teachings. After returning, Margaretta spent most of her day in her room reading the Bible, praying, meditating, and of course writing letters to Jacob, who would still visit, by the way, starting just 2 weeks after Margaretta and Elizabeth Elizabeth reappear. In the evenings, Margaretta would come downstairs from her room to receive visitors, preach, and give prophecies. So she's going all in on the prophetesting now. She's a prophet. But I will say, perhaps not the most elegant one. This is an example of one of her prophecies, and I don't know the setting in which this happened, but at some point she just cried out, "Behold, I see the host of Satan drawing nearer and nearer to encompass me. He strives to overcome me. Let me alone that I may fight him." And then she started swinging her arms in the air wildly, like swatting at invisible demons or something around her.
I feel like I've said this after like my fourth beer, you know? I'm prone to saying these exact words.
Look, everyone's welcome to drunkenly prophesize in the privacy of their own home. I just feel like when you have a crowd of 10 people watching this happen and believing it, that's when it gets a little problematic, perhaps.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
As you can see, Luis, this is, pretty extreme behavior that we're here to already. But it was even more extreme than this because at this point in time, only certain people who were deemed worthy would be allowed into the house. And at all other times, the front door would be kept bolted shut. And to show how far this had gone, the pastor of the local parish was one of the people who wasn't allowed into the house because he was deemed too worldly. So in addition to all of this kind of stuff going on, Margaretta would often tell her followers that they needed to be ready because some big test of their faith was coming. On one occasion, she even went as far as to ask them if they were ready to lay down their lives for Christ. And because of this, everyone in the house was constantly on edge and trying to find spiritual or prophetic meaning in everything that happened. One pretty funny example of this is one evening, Ursula and Margaret, these are two of the servants, were working at spinning wheels near the stove. A log inside the stove made a loud pop, and Margaret jumped up, threw over her spinning wheel, and yelled, "Hearken! Satan is banging at the window. He wants me. He will fetch me." Then immediately fell on the floor and started having a seizure. Someone has to go get Margaretta to come pray over her and basically do like a freestyle exorcism for this whole deal to get stopped. So as you can see, the tension's pretty high here, and it only keeps rising until finally Margaretta apparently decided that the Great War was upon them in March 1823. So Margaretta summoned her favorite quote-unquote biblical study partner, Jacob Morph, to come to Wildesburg.
Yeah.
She also summoned John Mosier. This is the sister's husband who kicked his own mother out of the house, and also John's brother Conrad. And on Monday, March 10th, 1823, John and Conrad arrived at the house, joining Jacob Morph, the servants, Margaretta, her brother and sisters, and her father. The next day, on Tuesday morning, most of the people in the house gathered in one of the rooms to watch Margaretta while she prayed and spoke in tongues. Then in the evening, Margaretta gathered everyone in her room upstairs and declared that she could see the devil and his firstborn floating in the air, ready to take over the earth. And her sister Elizabeth also says she can see them as well, which, this seems like big news. But then following this, everyone stood around in silence for about an hour until finally they realized that nothing else was going to happen, and so they all went to bed. Now the next day, Wednesday morning, Margaretta summoned everyone to her room to pray to the Lord for strength for a few hours. Then at noon, they decided to take a break to eat because apparently no one had been eating anything during this time. Now, after lunch, Margaretta revealed that she had an update from God, which, big if true, could be big news.
Yeah.
So Margaretta said, quote, "The Lord has revealed to me what will happen in the latter days. The son of Napoleon will appear before the world as Antichrist and will strive to bring the world over to his side." Now, just for the record, as you may remember, Luis, Napoleon's son, Napoleon II, was at this point in time 12 years old and serving as a cadet in the Austrian army, and by the way, was only 9 years away from feebly dying of tuberculosis. So not exactly Antichrist material, unless, of course, you're buying into the theory that Margaretta's actions in the story prevented him from becoming the Antichrist.
Yeah, he could have had a long reign after that, dying of tuberculosis. We never thought tuberculosis may have come as a plight from God.
Right.
I'm just saying.
So we have, Schrodinger's Antichrist here and Napoleon II. But either way, following this prophecy, Jacob, John, and Ursula all cried out that they see two evil spirits, one that looks like Napoleon and one that looks like his son, enter into Elizabeth and Margaret. After this, Elizabeth starts marching around the room like a soldier, then Margaretta has to do another pseudo-exorcism, and then the girls go back to normal, and that's the end of the events for the night. Then the following day, on Thursday, Margaretta prayed alone in her room from the morning until noon. That evening, she gathered everyone in her room and told them that it had been revealed to her that there would be a great battle, and she must fight for their souls. So she told everyone to pray. Then she jumped up and declared they needed to prepare for battle. In 1,260 days, the Antichrist would appear in human form and try to take over the world.
God math.
She's doing some big Bible math action. Where did we get that number? We're not showing any sources, okay? But then, update, literally just a second later, she apparently changed her mind and announced that the Antichrist was already among them, and then promptly started running around the room destroying furniture. And it seems somewhere in this destroying furniture process, she found a hammer and then started hitting the wall of the room, which caused Margaret to start having a seizure. But it seems that no one was really paying attention to Margaret's seizure because Margaretta was already prophesying again. She cried out, quote, "I see in spirit the old Napoleon gathering a mighty host and marching against me. The contest will be terrible. You must wrestle unto blood. Go, fly, fetch me axes, clubs, whatever you can find. Bar the doors, curtain all the windows in the house, and close every shutter." So her followers go and do this, then return with hatchets, pickaxes, crowbars, pitchforks, and clubs. And then Margaretta tells them to start destroying the room, which they do for the next 3 hours. At one point in this process, one of the walls was so badly destroyed that the crowd of people that had gathered outside, because obviously, people can hear this happening outside the house. So a bunch of people had gathered. The wall is so badly destroyed that there's a big hole in it, and this crowd of people is just looking through, watching the scene in complete confusion and terror. Margaretta at one point saw them and calls them, quote, "the enemies of God," so I guess it all factors in for her somehow. It's all according to plan. Finally, after 3 hours, Margaretta declared victory and then led her followers downstairs to the sitting room. And at this point, the crowd outside had surrounded the house and was banging on the door trying to get someone to let them in, but Margaretta and her followers basically are just ignoring them. In the sitting room, Margaretta first ordered her followers to do a little bit of celebrating of the victory. Then she ordered them to start beating themselves, which they did while Margaretta punched her sister Elizabeth.
Jeez.
And during this time, if anyone wasn't beating themselves hard enough, Margaretta would yell at them. And even at one point, she said her father wasn't beating himself hard enough, so she beat him unconscious, Luis. Her own father.
God. I did start kind of to chuckle at the sight of just people beating themselves up and then this woman going ham, just throwing hands at this other girl. But it really is sad. It's rough. I think it's good that this is an audio podcast.
So true. But, I think you're allowed to laugh at this part because, since you know the story, you know that they're going to all claim that this was stuff they wanted to do in like a couple days. Because around 3 hours later, the police finally arrived. Evidently, someone had called them. Initially, they were unsure what to do because it's 10 o'clock. There's no more noise coming from the house at this point. So they decided to just wait in the area and see what happens. At midnight, they heard commotion and cries coming from the house. So they knocked on the doors and window, but no one would let them in the front door. So they broke it in and found Margaretta and her followers beating each other unconscious. And the police tried to bring order to this situation so they could carry Margaretta's father out and get him medical attention, but the followers hang on to his body and drag the police down into a pile. Everyone's shouting in a panicked frenzy, and whenever the police try to talk to one of the followers, Margaretta tells them to pray instead of answer. So finally, the police just decide to separate them into 2 groups and put them in separate rooms for the rest of the night.
Come on. Again, the police being incompetent. Love it. Big fan.
Then the next day on Friday, one by one, the police questioned Margaretta and her followers, and all of them claimed to be acting on genuine religious conviction. So, as I was saying, Luis, they're all saying this is what they wanted to be doing. So, since they all claim to be just acting on their beliefs, there's not really an obvious crime there, because I guess it's not a crime to beat yourself unconscious. So, the police make their report, and then they just leave. They tell Jacob Morph, Conrad, and Ursula all to go back to their homes, but they don't actually stay to see if this happens, so only Jacob Morph really leaves. And it wouldn't be until a few days later on Sunday that the police would eventually send their report to the authorities in Zurich, who then would eventually send back orders to have Margaretta and Elizabeth committed to an asylum, but these orders would unfortunately arrive too late to do any good. So now we come back to Saturday morning. This is the day after the police have left. Margaretta gathered her followers, minus Jacob of course, together in her room and announced that they must save the soul of her brother Caspar. So she again tells her followers to start beating themselves, which they do. Margaretta then picked up an iron wedge, which is basically like the chopping part of an axe, and started hitting her brother Caspar in the head and chest with it. And as you might imagine, this did a lot of damage to Caspar. Split his head open and caused him to lose a lot of blood. And so finally, Margaretta's father and Margaret carried Caspar downstairs to his bed to rest. Quick little side note, while the father and Margaret are downstairs, a man named Elias Vogel knocked on the front door. He demanded to be let in, but Margaret's father told him he can't come in because the surgeon was in the house working right now. In fact, that's why he's covered in blood. Elias tried to force his way in, but the father and one of his daughters kept the door closed and kept him out. So after this, Elias leaves and then runs into a policeman. He tells the policeman what happens, but get this, the policeman decides he believes the father's story that the surgeon was in the house, and so he doesn't look into it any further. So once again, stellar policing from Switzerland.
Yeah, wonderful. Great work, Swiss police.
And literally probably at the same time this is happening, Margaretta is still in her room with her followers. She tells her followers that she must die to save their souls.
Ugh.
But suddenly, Luis, in a surprise turn of events, Elizabeth excitedly volunteers to be killed instead. And miraculously, just as this happens, Margaretta is quote-unquote informed that the plan was actually for Elizabeth to sacrifice herself all along. It worked out so well.
It's a voice from God that came at the very last minute. Whoa.
Breaking news, update from God. My sister must die. So Margaretta picked up an iron hammer and began hitting Elizabeth in the head with it, while others joined in with boards and the iron wedge. And during this time, if anyone hesitates or isn't being aggressive enough, both Margaretta and Elizabeth would yell at them to keep going until they kill her. Now, of course, after a few moments, Elizabeth was dead. But Margaretta was not done yet. Still sitting next to her sister's dead corpse, holding the bloody hammer, she said, quote, "More blood must flow.
Ugh.
I have pledged myself for the saving of many souls. I must die now. You must crucify me." And her followers were understandably a little bit hesitant at this, but Margaretta assured them it was no big deal because she was going to raise herself and Elizabeth from the dead in just 3 days. So
just 3 days.
Full speed ahead because we're going to get a resurrection. They nail Margaretta's hands, elbow, feet, and chest to wood blocks. And allegedly during this process, Margaretta did not seem to be in any pain. She tells her followers to use a nail or knife to stab her through the heart. Ursula tried several times with a knife, but was evidently unable to hit Margaretta's heart. So instead, Margaretta commanded her followers, quote, "Beat in my skull," which they did with a crowbar and hammer.
Yikes.
Now, after they were finished sacrificing Margaretta, it was noon on Saturday, and apparently this had worked up an appetite, so the followers went downstairs to eat the lunch that Margaret had been preparing. After lunch, the police arrived to notify Margaretta's father that Margaretta and Elizabeth will have to appear before a judge at some point, and Margaretta's father signed a document promising to ensure his daughters will be present, literally while their dead bodies were still lying in the room above him. The following day, on Sunday, Jacob Morph arrived. He was completely unaware of what had happened, and when he saw the girls' dead bodies, he fainted, immediately decided that this was a horrifying tragedy and no miracle is going to happen, and quickly returned home to his village.
Good call.
Later that night, Ursula and Heinrich removed the nails from Margaretta's body so they don't interfere with her resurrection. And this is interesting that even at this point where they've, literally got 2 dead bodies in this room, they're still, believers thinking that this resurrection is going to happen.
Right.
The next day, Monday, was mostly spent praying and reading scripture. And then finally, on Tuesday, Margaretta's father realized that this had all been a terrible mistake. He went to the local pastor to tell him that Elizabeth and Margaretta had died on Saturday, and this, of course, led to a lot of follow-up questions, and the answers to these questions, of course, led to arrests. So, a group trial of Margaretta's followers took place on December 3rd, 1823. Ursula was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Margaretta's father and Conrad both received 8 years. Margaretta's sisters, Susanna and John Mosier, were both sentenced to 6 years. Heinrich received 4 years. Jacob Morph received 3 years. Margaret received 2. Margaretta's sister Barbara and her brother Caspar were each sentenced to 1 year in prison, and Margaretta's sister Magdalena was sentenced to 6 months hard labor. After this, the authorities ordered the house to be demolished, and the earth plowed and turned over so nothing remained. The authorities ordered the spot where the house stood to be left permanently empty. So as far as I know, Luis, there is still an empty spot in Switzerland today where Margaretta, the Messiah's house, once stood.
Hey, man, did anyone keep watch of that dead body? Who knows? Maybe she did come back. Maybe she did come back and saved us all.
She resurrected just to be buried alive at the last second.
Or perhaps you're like me, who is still waiting for her resurrection. I'm still anxiously crossing all of my fingers, both hands and toes, waiting for Margaretta to come save me.
So, Luis, now you've heard this story twice, and as we previously discussed, your goldfish brain, so who knows what the recollection from the first time was, but I'm assuming that you have a pretty good grasp on, this series of events now. We also talked about before how it's interesting, number one, that this is a lot farther back in time than you would see most cults happen, and number two, that most cults seem to inflict a lot of the abuse or kind of damage on the followers, but it seems like even though, Margaret is telling her followers to beat themselves, she was at any moment willing to be crucified for her own beliefs, that she really did. She was high on her own supply, you know. She was drinking her own Kool-Aid, no doubt.
You know, it's also a bit of a surprise that this cult is coming out of a place that's not the U.S., right? We tend to think of Reformation and these great awakenings to come from, you know, the United States. Like, we see all these different religions that sprouted from then, like, I don't know, the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, etc. You know, they all come from the United States. But to see someone from Switzerland coming way early, that's a tale in itself.
Yeah, it's you know, cults every time are an odd happening, and this is like an odd happening among odd happenings. You know, it's just a really bizarre situation, which makes it even stranger that neither you nor I had heard about this until it was introduced to this podcast. But all in all, do you have any thoughts on this cult story as a whole? I don't know if there really are any thoughts to have. I mean, we covered that Switzerland's policing is kind of asleep at the wheel in this time period. Also, you know, Margaretta is really just making it up as she goes along with Napoleon II and curing seizures and whatnot. But anything other than that, Luis?
Maybe she should have stayed Catholic. I don't know. Just a thought. Look at me. Look at me. Nearly 10 years under Catholic education, and I am the most well-adjusted person I know. So, I don't know. I don't want to say take me as an example, but I mean, I've turned out fine. I'm not crucifying anyone right now, least of all myself.
You know, there is, I think, an interesting question of like, at what point, if any, did Margaretta start believing this sincerely? Maybe she always believed this kind of stuff, but
6 years old, Kurt.
6 years old, but she's also going from like different subgenres of Protestantism, because, you know, keep in mind, this same pastor who says a quote about, oh, she's so in charge of her household, this is the guy who like 5 years later they won't even let in the house because he's too worldly. So she just completely blew past her Zwinglianism in favor of this, you know, Margarettaism, I guess. But it does make you wonder, was there a point where she was intentionally trying to start a movement, or was she just always a believer in this? You know, that makes me want to ask you, Luis, because we discussed last time, you said this is probably not the cult for you.
Yeah.
You would be an excellent cult follower, but this one I think just does not suit you. It's a lot of work, you were saying, the self-beating, you know, you got to put in a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, I'm willing to do a lot of things to myself and make a fool of myself, plenty. But I do not like to injure myself, let alone others.
Right.
So that's where I would draw the line. And God, let alone I step foot in Switzerland, Kurt.
Whoa, the Switzerland slander. What
just
is going
kidding.
on here?
Just kidding, Switzerland. I love you, but you know what you did.
Well, okay, so I have another question, because we already know you would not be a follower of this cult. But, you know, I guess there's a small chance that maybe Margaretta didn't really believe in this stuff at all. She just was like going along with the movement and, you know, what's giving her power. And then she accidentally like paints herself into a corner where she has to get crucified and just hope that she resurrects. Could you see yourself in that situation, Luis? You're riding the wave of the Protestant Reformation, becoming a cult leader, and you accidentally set yourself up for crucifixion.
I mean, there's probably more of me there, Kurt. Yeah, I agree. But, you know, I think if I'm going to become Protestant, I'll probably be the type of Protestant that gets tied up into a corner. But that corner means I have to buy a private plane. You know, just like all these other Christian evangelists that go out and say, hey, I'm sorry, there was nothing I could do. I just had to buy another private jet. That's how I would be. I probably wouldn't drive myself to the point of crucifixion. I'd play my cards right. You know, if I was a cult leader, I'd do it right, Kurt. And I would do the most to benefit me. Because at the end of the day, that's what you need to do. It's benefit you at the expense of others. And I feel like I can see myself doing that. Take that as you will, of course.
Maybe you'd become a cult leader and paint yourself into a corner where you're forced to acquire one of the tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, in addition to several other cuneiform tablets.
That's right, yeah.
Just because it correlates to the prophecy that you made up on the spot.
That's true.
Big
That's
update
true.
from God. We got to read the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Sorry, U.S. Customs. I just had to have approximately 450 cuneiform tablets.
Sorry, TSA. I've had a vision. I've had an update from God after lunch. All right, Luis. Well, I've now told you the story of Margaretta and her little cult twice over. Let's get some new content in here. Do you have, in fact, a true tale for me?
Indeed I do, Kurt. And even in my delirious brain, I think I can form a cohesive story just for you, just because I care about you just so much.
Even in your regular brain, you can't form a cohesive story.
Okay, moving on. Kurt, you like movies, right?
That is true. You know, you people who listen to the podcast might not know this, but my primary career field is doing movie stuff.
That's right. He's a big cinematography boy. And I wanted to make sure I bring that up with you, because I feel like I don't bring it up enough in this episode. We've talked enough about my journalistic roots. We've talked enough about other stuff I do, but let me talk about you.
That's true. I deserve to be shamed for my liberal arts degree too.
I mean, us with our liberal college degree.
Our liberal Jesuit college degree.
Oh, God, again. See, it all comes back to the Jesuits. Well, you like movies, Kurt. You know who else liked movies?
Adolf Hitler.
No. Well, maybe. Actually, I think he did. But
maybe. Who knows?
Who knows? I didn't ask him.
Don't forget Leni Riefenstahl, dude.
Oh, Leni Riefenstahl loved movies.
Who is it, Luis? Please, get us out of here. Tell me.
Sorry. Well, I was going to say Alphonse XIII, King of Spain.
Oh, of course. Alphonse XIII, King of Spain. How could I forget that?
Yeah, you know him? Good guy.
Oh, every film 101 course, they're like, we're going to be spending approximately 6 months on Alphonse 13th, I think it was.
Alphonse XIII, yeah, 13th. So Alphonse XIII became king at birth, you know, when his dad died.
Nice.
Right before he was born.
Sick.
Which his dad, funny enough, Alphonse XII, just something important there. Now, he was born in 1886. He became king in 1886 when he was born, but didn't accept the crown until 16 years later when he was 16.
Okay.
That's early 1900s, right? So this man is now king. And he did all the different things that kings do, which at this point, early 1900s, Spain in specific, what is the king but just a rich guy, just a Spanish elite? So he did all the things that Spanish elite people do.
Yeah, I was going to say, what are the kings even doing in the, like, you know, the turn of the century? It's just like traveling around all the places that were your former colonies and begging them to continue trading with you or whatever, right?
Basically, yeah. It's like Industrial Revolution. The war's about to arrive. There's really not a whole lot going on. So you just do rich people stuff. Plus, it's like 1910s, 1920s. Credit scores don't exist. Well, credit has been invented now. So everyone's just paying everything on credit. We're making money. We're never going to die, right? We're in that point of history.
Don't tell me the king is paying on credit.
Oh, no, Kurt.
That's just over the top decadence.
No,
That would be a very kingly thing to do, to have just stores of gold and be like, yeah, put it in my credit card.
that's right.
Let me run up my
Yeah.
credit.
It's going to Woolworths and buying pearls at like 12 months without interest.
And put on layaway.
Well, here's the thing, Kurt. Part of the things that the rich like to do at this point was indulge in the new and modern technology, which in this case is movies. Okay?
Ooh.
Movies are all the rage because they've just been invented. There are not a lot of movie theaters in the world. The Lumiere brothers are still alive, so this is how old movies are at this point.
Wowee.
Yeah, it's early 1900s. It's great.
A Maid Germain is out there
Yeah,
trying to get back her stolen invention.
That's right. Now, Alphonse is also a big fan of movies and becomes a really big fan of movies, to the point where he starts asking and requesting for movies to be shown at the Royal Palace, which, funny enough, he gets a cinema or just a place to view movies in the Royal Palace. So he loves this kind of stuff.
They didn't have Netflix back then?
Not really. Not really. There's not a whole lot more to do.
It was still the mail version of Netflix, where they just like send you the disc in the mail. Yeah.
It was Redbox, actually, back in the day.
Oh yeah,
it's
they have Redbox
They
in
had
Spain.
Redbox,
Okay,
yeah.
Cool.
But funny enough, you know, he's the king. And not only is he a king, Kurt, but he was a Bourbon, right? And the Bourbon monarchy, let's just say, they've always been known for, other than being rich, their sexual debauchery, okay? Or shenanigans.
It's quite the family legacy to have.
I mean, Kurt, you've got a royal family going back generations. So the Bourbons, I mean, they start in France. And who's the who are the kings of decadence, sexual decadence? Of course, it's going to be the French. So there's just another branch of that, but now in Spain. Now, it is said that early in the 1900s, so this guy is probably no older than 24, he just discovers something that will change the trajectory of his life. And that is, Kurt.
Bisexuality.
No, porn. He discovers pornography.
Oh, whoa.
And not just pornography.
Oh, that was not what I was expecting at all.
But pornographic films. Okay.
Well, yeah, I assume. What are they bringing him, the paintings?
Well, at one point, it is said that these these producers brought him that would bring him movies. Eventually, brought him a porn, sexually explicit film, and immediately this guy was hooked from the get-go, right? To the point where he started funding this production company, which was a production company from two Catalonian guys, funny enough, named Royal Films, in English, Royal Films.
Nice.
And not only did they distribute movies to the king and, commercial movies to show with families and stuff like that, but it is said that once they had these official press events, they would also go into the halls of the royal palace and the king to show just him, the latest pornographic film. Now, Alphonse XIII became so involved with royal films that he started giving them money. He became their number one patron, right? But of course, patrons are not known as that in the film industry, Kurt. So you could call Alphonse the executive producer of royal films.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Not just that, Kurt. He became so entranced in these porn movies that he started actually giving a helping hand in the casting. Right? So Alphonse, not only was he known for his love of pornographic films.
He's like, my brother's wife, she'd be great for one of these movies.
Well, it would be great if it was kept in the family, but no, actually. He was known to go to brothels and, get involved in extramarital affairs and know like a whole neighborhood of prostitutes, I guess.
Wow.
So he was known for heading off into Barcelona's Chinese district or the Chinese neighborhood. And that was at the time, so early 1900s, where most prostitutes and brothels used to be. And he was often seen there several times. It is said that there was one time when he arrived, he already had a room that he really liked in one specific brothel.
Wow.
He knew his way around the town in a way of speaking.
Yeah.
And this gave him the opportunity to know which people were the best to cast in his films.
That's so interesting because I was going to ask, you talked about, they're well known for the debauchery. So it's not like this man is, like he could go out and get a prostitute anytime he wants. Or
Yeah.
like he's the king. So he's just fully in this, for the love of the game,
Mm-hmm.
He's in it for the art form because it's not like he's, just really horny or whatever. Like he could go take care of that. No, he's like, this is cinema.
Lighting up a cigarette, looking at the screen saying, ugh, nothing better than this. It doesn't get better than this, huh, guys?
We come to this place.
Exactly. But funny enough, Kurt, so the first pornographic movie that he was shown was probably something coming out of France or Germany.
Of course.
Right? So when he started producing these films, he was actually the reason that these films were first made in Spain in the first place. Right? He's the reason the first Spanish pornographic films were made. And like I said, not only did he have a hand in the casting, he personally handpicked which people would be in his movies. He also had a hand in the script writing, which is it's incredible to have this passion.
I told you, dude, he's in it for the love of the game.
Yeah, he really was, because not only that, Kurt, he, like most other kings, and especially Spanish kings, his upbringing was fully intertwined with Catholicism. So even if
that'll do it.
Even if he
frankly.
had other interests as a young man, because it is said that he loved cars. I mean, obviously he loved women, but I guess he loved God too. So much so that in his scripts he would try to put in facets of Catholicism and his own faith into these pornographic films.
Oh, that's really intriguing. Whoa, he's really in it for the cinema.
Very curious because, okay, just a little quick fast forward on this. He had a hand in making like dozens of films. He was very prolific in the porn industry.
Wow.
But sadly, only 3 films remain in existence of the ones that we know he had a hand in making. Which, interestingly enough, they were found in a convent in Valencia. So again, we're attaching it more to this Christian side and the Valencia government.
What were they doing with him in the convent? Well, boy, I bet that convent was sad when they took those 3 movies away.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Kurt, because the convent, I mean, the Valencian state, right, they restored the film and they kept it in their film library. And the names of these, Kurt, the names of these 3 surviving films are The Confessor, that's one.
Okay, good start.
The Minister.
Oh.
And The Women's Clinic.
Oh.
And I've looked into these, as research, of course.
I've only done research in some vivid detail.
But Kurt, first of all, these movies are all silent films. They're black and white and silent films. So if you look at them back today, it's like looking back at a Charlie Chaplin film. So it looks all like sped up weirdly, right?
Does it have the subtitle cards where it's just moaning?
It does, Kurt. It really does.
No. This man understood cinema.
He really did. And interestingly, like you see these, one of them's a confessor, one of them's a minister, and the other one's a clinic, right? So what you're getting here is you're interlacing religious themes of like a pastor going after young women, right? Or in other case, like doctors and things like that.
It doesn't play so well these days.
Doesn't play so well, but I mean, again, this is exactly what the king wanted. He probably wrote this, and he also chose who was going to be in it.
Right.
And yeah, that's Alphonse the 13th. And funny enough, of course, Kurt, because you're a politician, you can't really know, or you can't really let your people know that you're directly involved with this sort of business. So he used the president of Spain as his intermediary.
Wow.
Right? So this was the Count of Romanones, who was the president, right? Because Spain has a monarchical republic. He was used as the intermediary between the king and royal films, which honestly, I couldn't find more information on this, but the fact that this production company is called Royal Films, very fitting. Probably they changed their names to fit the fact that they were providing the king with pornography.
I really respect this maneuver because I feel like if you're going to be the king of a country, you got 2 options. If you want to be a cool king, right? Yeah. Like number 1 is go conquer a bunch of stuff, which only works for a small select few people.
Yeah.
The other option is like just don't try to do any of that, but acknowledge that you randomly have a whole bunch of power to do absolutely whatever you want with it, and do stupid stuff like direct porn and make the president go like be your intermediary on your behalf.
Right.
Frankly, I think it's a real power play from this guy. I really respect it.
And I think it was a power play. I mean, if you're king since you're born, you have all these privileges to do whatever the hell you want. Now, one thing where he wasn't really good at, I mean, we know he was a prolific pornography director. He wasn't a great husband. Right.
Oops.
Which it's not hard to imagine. I mean, of course, he had extramarital affairs. He knew personally all the different brothels around Madrid. And not only that, but right now we can name 5 extramarital children that he had.
No, he's just doing a little auditioning, Luis. He's just auditioning some new talent,
right.
Okay? That's his job as a director.
Yeah, that you can call it whatever you want. But, he did have 5 bastard children that we know of, and his wife really didn't like him. Right. I think she found out about this stuff.
Oh.
There's been an anecdote that said that apparently he smelled terribly, like his mouth stank. So you don't like someone, then they stink.
Like a brothel, probably.
Like, just imagine drinking, smoking, and prostitutes. What can that do to oral hygiene?
That's a tangy musk right there.
Oh, God. Gross, but yes. Now, at this point, Kurt, so early 1900s, there are a lot of things going wrong. We already had the war, the First World War, and Spain is losing colonies and territories in like Africa. So people are not really happy with this guy because, you can see that he's doing all this debaucherous things. And meanwhile, there's a lot of political turmoil in Spain.
Oops.
And one of the biggest cases of political turmoil in Spain at this point obviously is early 1930s. Who's coming into power but Francisco Franco? Right. And it is said that the government was so poorly managed. A lot of critics of Alphonse say that he basically opened the door for Francisco Franco to take power in the Second Spanish Republic.
Because he was so busy directing porn.
He was so busy directing porn that he let the country go to the toilet. Now, in 1931, he's actually exiled. He's kicked out of Spain, and he goes to France. And his wife takes this as an opportunity to get the hell out of Dodge. She goes to London and never sees him again. They would never be in the same country ever again because years later, in 1941, Alphonse XIII would die in Rome under, of course, Francisco Franco, still in power. So he dies in 1941. Pornographic films in Spain would not become legal until 1980s.
Whoa. So was it just like not a loophole, but like he's just doing it even though it's illegal and nobody says anything because he's a king?
I mean, at this point, Kurt, he's the pioneer of it. There probably weren't any laws for it. So with the Franco government, that's when laws against this kind of nature of film were set in place, and they were finally removed in the 80s, 40 years after this great pioneer of pornographic film in Spain died. Oh, also, he was the king. And because of everything else that he did, or all of this that he did, he is now nicknamed or remembered in history as the Playboy King.
That's pretty good as far as king nicknames go, I mean, normally it's either like something specifically you were good to the people or you were bad to the people. Once in a while you get nicknamed the Bewitched because, inbreeding and such not. But the Playboy is pretty good, I think, as far as king nicknames go.
Yeah.
I'd personally be happy with that.
Yeah. So that's Alphonse XIII, Kurt. Really a flame that was taken away from us too soon, all for a fascist dictator to come by and stop the fun for all of us. Typical.
That's how it always ends up going. Well, I think given that we've got like a nice little contrast of I'd say from the first story, Margaretta Peter definitely too invested, too stressed out about her own thing she's got going on. Nice to see Alphonse get in here and be like, hey, look, head empty. I got no responsibilities that I absolutely have to do. I'm just gonna go make some raunchy cinema. All right, try and stop me. I'm already in the brothel. Too late. Man, he's just like I said, he's in his blissful ignorance, just making some movies. Whatever happens to Spain happens. Come on, baby, let it ride.
Let it ride.
That's amazing. You gotta love that. How can you not love that?
How could you not? I do. Very much so. Okay, Kurt. Well, that was my story. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I had some fun telling it. I had some fun researching this, if I'm going to be fully honest.
Was there a reason you picked that story to tell as the true tale? Did you think maybe I'd already know that from film knowledge, or was that just the one that came up?
No, fun fact. My dad sent me a reel on Instagram about this guy.
What was this reel of, Luis? The minister, perhaps?
The women's clinic.
The women's clinic, was it?
Oh, shout out to my father who sent me this information. What would I do without you, Dad, for sending me topics of this podcast, even if they're of a lascivious nature?
That's nice to know that you're getting story ideas from your dad too, because I will say I get probably like 10% of my story ideas from my dad. So it's really just forget us. It's just our dads running this podcast. All we have is the knowledge of how to use a laptop.
That's right.
If they knew that, they could run away with this podcast without us.
Yeah, your dad and my dad could do wonders with this podcast.
Well, I didn't say this at the top of the episode, but in our lost recording, Luis, you, of course, no surprise to anyone, but you did, in fact, guess the correct story. Mm-hmm. So it's 1 more point for Luis. That makes it 7-2,
Kurt,
which...
you know what? I'm feeling benevolent. Since we don't have evidence of the previous episode, I'm going to say that whatever points were granted or lost are now null and void. So we can go back to the pre-episode score.
Oh, wow.
So what does this bring us to?
We're back to 6-2. Hopefully that will actually make a difference for me. We'll see. It's anybody's guess right now.
Yeah.
I'm even gonna get close to this or not.
Yeah, just make sure you don't start losing recordings all of a sudden just to keep your score, Kurt.
Well, I feel like we've really covered all our bases today. I mean, we started with, Protestant Reformation and got so pious that it was definitely not good for us. A couple people died. That's no laughing matter. And then we just went maximum head empty. We're the king. No one can check us.
Yeah.
We're just gonna make some movies and see what happens.
Oh, yeah.
And then give Franco the country. So be it. So I feel like we've really covered the whole spectrum here. So that being said, everyone, hope you enjoyed these stories. If you did, please leave us a review. Tell your friends and family about it. You know what? Just go out on the street and shout the name of this podcast. Who knows? Maybe it'll work. All right, we're open to any ideas. Okay.
Yeah,
no
right.
bad ideas in a brainstorm. Come on.
That's right.
If you want to see some extra content from the episodes, some pictures relating to these stories, check out our social medias. We're on Instagram at UnbelievablePod and Twitter / its forbidden name X at UnbelievablePC. And remember, folks, when in doubt, crucify yourself or find someone else who wants to be crucified in order to stop Napoleon II from becoming the Antichrist who will die of tuberculosis at age 21 and get behind them because apparently they'll do all the work.
Simple as that.
Anyway, bye y'all.
See ya.